unfold.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking what is probably one of the most famous, one of the most heartwarming stories of the Cold War.
Yeah, it's a story that usually gets treated as a cute historical sidebar.
Exactly. And we're going to treat it like what it actually was.
Yeah.
A profound, and I would argue, a strategic geopolitical maneuver.
That's the goal. We're plunging right into Operation Little Vittles. Our mission for this deep dive is to move way beyond just the charm of the candy bomber story.
Right.
We want to really analyze how this small, completely spontaneous sub-operation, a part of the massive Berlin airlift, how it managed to become something so much more than a simple humanitarian gesture.
It became, in effect, a critical piece of soft power.
A really critical piece. It became a symbol that, that really defined the moral and even the emotional contours of the early Cold War conflict.
Okay, so let's unpack that core paradox right at the very beginning. The Berlin airlift itself, codenamed Operation Vittles by the U.S.
Or Operation Plainfare by the British.
Right. It was maybe the greatest operational inversion in the entire history of strategic air power.
It really is a singularity. You have to sort of zoom out to get the full irony of it. I mean, think about the context. Just 3 years before this, these exact same types of Allied aircraft were flying deep into Germany.
And their bellies weren't full of food?
No. They were full of incendiaries and high explosives. They were part of a total war campaign that was designed to reduce German cities to dust and rubble.
The psychological whiplash of that pivot must have been just immense for everyone involved.
Absolutely. So now, only 36 months later, the Allies are back, but they're not carrying bombs. They're carrying flour, coal, dehydrated potatoes.
The essentials for survival.
The goal had flipped a complete 180. It went from the destruction of infrastructure and morale to the total preservation of that very same population.
And the scale of Operation Vittles, the main airlift? I mean, it was an organizational leviathan.
Oh, it was staggering. If you look at the final output, it ultimately delivered over 2.3 million tons of supplies.
To a city of 2.5 million people.
A city completely cut off by the Soviets. It demanded an efficiency and a coordination that was, it was just unprecedented.
But that's where the paradox lies in that comparison.
Yeah.
We talk about the 2.3 million tons of life-sustaining cargo, which was absolutely necessary for survival.
Of course.
And yet today, we're immediately pivoting to this much smaller, completely unauthorized, and let's be honest, tactically insignificant sub-operation.
Operation Little Vittles.
Exactly.
If you're just looking at a balance sheet, roughly 23 tons of candy and gum dropped over the whole operation?
It's nothing.
It's a rounding error compared to the millions of tons of food and fuel. But the psychological weight, the diplomatic weight carried by those 23 tons was just disproportionately enormous.
You could argue it achieved a moral victory that the coal and flour alone just couldn't.
I think you absolutely could.
So our deep dive today is specifically about analyzing how Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen's initial, very simple idea achieved a psychological victory that just vastly outweighed its material value.
Yeah, we're going to get into the mechanics of that soft power, the incredible grassroots movement it kicked off back in the U.S., and how this one simple act of empathy became a physical, a tangible symbol of the transatlantic alliance.
We'll be synthesizing archival records, operational data, all of it.
It's really the story of how 2 sticks of gum helped change the course of history for an entire generation.
To really appreciate the profound resonance of a small chocolate bar falling from the sky, we have to start in the geopolitical crucible of 1948.
We have to. You have to establish the sensory reality, the material reality of post-war Berlin.
A city that was physically shattered, but also, and this is critical, existing in a state of moral and economic freefall. This was Germany in the 0 hour.
The immediate post-war reality was just one of absolute devastation and a really, really uneasy division of the country.
Germany was split between the 4 victorious powers.
Right, and the capital, Berlin, which was deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, was itself split into 4 sectors. The alliance that won the war it was disintegrating in real time.
And the flashpoint for that disintegration wasn't a battle. It was economics. It was the currency reform.
It was almost unavoidable, really, given the state of the German economy. The old currency, the Reichsmark, was utterly worthless.
Not just devalued, worthless.
Completely. Hyperinflation had destroyed it. It was a dead currency. People were, using it to light their stoves. Kids were playing with stacks of it like blocks.
And you mentioned cigarettes were the de facto currency.
Mm.
What does a reality like that actually mean for day-to-day life?
It means all normal commerce has just stopped. Everything is barter, or it's on the black market, or it's priced in American cigarettes.
Tall malls or camels, specifically?
You got it. And that is not a stable economic base. So the Western allies, the U.S., the U.K., and France, they're trying to administer their zones based on the Marshall Plan.
The idea being to stabilize the German economy so it's resistant to a communist takeover, make it self-sufficient.
Exactly. And their solution to try and fix this hyperinflation was radical. On June 18th, 1948, they introduced a new currency in their Western zones.
The Deutschmark.
That one act was the trigger. The Soviets, who had this tight economic grip on their zone, they saw the Deutschmark as a direct, aggressive economic attack.
They saw it as the West creating a viable West German state right under their noses.
Precisely. A violation of the Potsdam Agreement, which said Germany should be treated as a single economic unit. It was an existential threat to their control.
And their retaliation was immediate.
Immediate and deliberate. They introduced their own currency, the Ostmark, and then they began the process of just strangling West Berlin to force the Allies out.
That strangulation became known as the Iron Noose, the mechanisms of the Soviet blockade. It kicked off on June 24th, 1948.
And this was a clear strategy of weaponized starvation. It was coercion, plain and simple.
How comprehensive was it?
It was absolute. They cut off all ground access. They halted all rail traffic, passenger and freight coming from the west. They severed all access via the Autobahn.
So no road access?
None. And critically, they stopped all the river barges on the canals. Those barges carried the really heavy stuff. Coal and food. West Berlin was now an island 110 miles deep inside Soviet territory.
And the city's clock was ticking. The sources we have confirm West Berlin had about 36 days of food left.
And maybe even more critically, only 45 days of coal stocks. And they were heading straight into a brutal Central European winter.
On top of that, the caloric intake was already at starvation levels for many people, wasn't it?
It was. Before the blockade even started, many Berliners were already living on diets hovering around 900 to 1,000 calories a day.
So they were already on the brink.
They were. The Soviet calculation was simple and brutal. The city would starve or freeze into submission within a matter of weeks, and the Western Allies would have no choice but to abandon it.
So if we put ourselves into the sensory landscape of that city, we can start to understand the mindset of the children Gail Halvorsen was about to meet.
It was a devastated landscape. People who were there described it as a moonscape, just jagged skeletons of buildings piercing the sky.
But it was more than just visual destruction, right? It was a sensory assault.
It really was, and the blockade just amplified it. You mentioned the pervasive smell earlier. That's a detail that tells you so much.
It's often missed in the history books.
It is. But the air was thick with the smell of wet ash, of pulverized masonry, and the scent of unwashed bodies.
And why unwashed bodies?
Because the blockade cut the power for the pumping stations. Essential city services just collapsed. Our sources note that 87 major sewage systems were non-functional.
And that kind of failure, that leads directly to a public health disaster.
Immediately. You get outbreaks of typhus, dysentery. These aren't minor illnesses. These are mass killers. So for the 2.5 million people trapped there, the threat of disease was almost as terrifying as the threat of starvation.
And for the children, their life was described as a troglodytic existence.
Like cave dwellers, they were living in cellars and old bomb shelters and the hollowed-out shells of buildings.
The descriptions are always of them being ragged, shoeless,
perpetually hungry. And we'll talk about Mercedes Wilde in more detail later, but she recalled that the central paralyzing fear wasn't just the cold or the hunger.
It was the Russians.
It was the fresh, visceral memory of the Soviet conquest in 1945, the looting, the violence, the uncertainty. The memory of their arrival was the Soviets' strongest weapon in enforcing submission.
So against this backdrop of just absolute Soviet pressure, General Lucius D. Clay, the U.S. military governor, he's got 3 options on the table.
And none of them are good. He could try to break the blockade on the ground with an armored column.
Which would risk armed conflict, maybe even World War III.
Right. Or he could withdraw. Just abandon West Berlin and hand a massive moral and strategic victory to the USSR.
Or the third option, the air bridge.
The great gamble. And he chose the air bridge. But this wasn't just a political call, it was a logistical one. He needed a bare minimum of 4,500 tons of supplies delivered daily.
just to keep the city at a subsistence level.
And the initial estimates from the experts were, well, they were deeply skeptical.
You can see why. The numbers are daunting.
They are. Before the blockade, the city got about 12,000 tons of supplies a month by rail. Now they had to move over 135,000 tons a month just by air.
Using only those 3 narrow, restricted air corridors the Soviets had agreed to after the war.
The operation needed a genius, and they found one.
Major General William H. Tunner. He's the architect who basically turns the airlift into this machine of just unparalleled efficiency.
Tunner was the guy who ran the hump, the huge logistical operation over the Himalayas in World War II. He understood high-volume air traffic better than anyone.
And he brought in what was called the conveyor belt strategy.
That's it. He treated the skies and the runways like one massive assembly line, not as a series of individual flights. Maximizing throughput was everything.
So precision and throughput were the religion of Operation Vittles. How did he actually achieve those incredible landing rates?
He was just ruthless about eliminating any inefficiency. At first, aircraft were spaced 3 minutes apart, which people thought was a miracle.
But he pushed it further.
Oh, much further.
Yeah.
Using new ground radar systems, GCA, or ground-controlled approach, and incredibly specialized ground crews, he got that interval down to an unbelievable 30 seconds between planes landing.
30 seconds. That is military-grade synchronization. If you think about the time a plane needs to touch down, slow down, get off the runway, there is zero margin for error.
Zero. And standardization was key. He set up these strict, non-negotiable flight paths. Inbound planes used the northern and southern corridors. Outbound used the central one.
So it's a one-way traffic system in the sky.
Exactly. It eliminated the risk of mid-air collisions and kept the flow seamless.
And that brings us to the legendary no second chances rule. Tell us about the brutal efficiency of that mandate.
If a pilot missed their approach, say because of fog, crosswinds, pilot fatigue, whatever.
You can't just circle around for another track.
Forbidden. Absolutely forbidden. You had to immediately power up and fly all the way back to West Germany with your full cargo.
10 tons of supplies.
Yeah.
Wasted, in a sense. Why was that rule so sacred?
Because one plane circling for even 3 minutes would disrupt the entire chain behind it. It would back up dozens of aircraft. Efficiency was more important than any single cargo load.
Tunner's system was designed for maximum pressure. Delays were the enemy.
The ultimate enemy.
And what about the machinery itself? What were the planes, the workhorses of this operation?
Initially, they used the old C-47 Skytrain. Reliable, but it only had a 3-ton capacity.
Which was quickly seen as not enough.
Not nearly enough. The operation needed more tonnage per flight, so the Douglas C-54 Skymaster became the undisputed workhorse. It could carry 10 tons.
And that's the plane Gail Halvorsen flew.
It is. He specifically favored it for its 4 powerful engines and its stability. He knew it could handle Central Europe's notoriously violent and unpredictable weather.
Let's not forget the human toll on the air crews. They weren't flying in perfect conditions.
Not at all. They were under immense strain, flying 3 round trips a day, often in blinding fog, through heavy snowstorms.
And they were being harassed by the Soviets.
Constantly. Soviet Yak fighters would buzz the air corridors. It was pure psychological warfare, forcing the pilots to stay vigilant every second. They lived primitively, sleeping in tents or barns near the runways, completely focused on the clock.
And this brings us to a really crucial point about the psychology of the operation before Little Vittles began. Despite all this intensity and sacrifice, there was this profound psychological distance between the American crews and the Berliners.
Absolutely. The prevailing sentiment, even 3 years after VE Day, was that the Germans were still the former enemy.
Halvorsen himself admitted he struggled with that. The morality of risking his life to feed the people who started the war.
He was very honest about it. And the interaction was purely transactional. It was dictated by Tunner's conveyor belt. Pilots landed, German laborers unloaded the plane in minutes, the pilots took off again. There was no time, and frankly no space for empathy or personal connection in that highly disciplined, mechanized system.
So we have this massive, ruthless machine of efficiency run by Tunner. But if efficiency was everything, where did empathy even fit into the picture?
Empathy arrived in the form of 2 sticks of gum.
This is it, the genesis of the candy bomber. The moment the transactional airlift turned into something else entirely.
A humanitarian crusade powered by soft power.
And it all happened on one specific day, July 17, 1948. Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen. He's new to the mission. He's off duty.
And he decides to go do some, private filming of the planes landing at Tempelhof. He hitchhikes over to the perimeter fence to get a better view.
And that's where he has this catalyst moment. He runs into a group of about 30 children.
Ranging from about 8 to 14 years old. And this is the moment that just immediately shatters his ingrained military assumptions about the German people.
How so? What was so unexpected about their reaction to him?
Well, in his experience as an American GI, he was used to being a magnet for begging. He fully expected to hear kids yelling for chocolate or kagumi.
Chocolate or chewing gum.
Right. But these kids, they didn't beg. They just stood there silently, watching the planes, almost with reverence.
And when they did speak to him, they weren't asking for handouts.
No, they engaged him in broken English and started asking these incredibly sophisticated operational questions about the C-54s, their cargo capacity, the duration of the airlift.
Their silence and their focus on the logistics must have just thrown him completely.
It did. It showed this maturity, this shared understanding of the geopolitical reality that he just wasn't prepared for.
So, struck by this, he eventually asked them about their hunger, about living on 1,000 calories a day.
And their reply is what just cements this moment into history. It provides the ideological justification for the entire operation, really.
What did they say?
It was haunting and profoundly ideological. They told him, when the weather gets so bad that you can't land, don't worry about us. We can get by on a little food, but if we lose our freedom, we may never get it back.
Wow. They're not just kids. They are articulating a Cold War rationale for the entire airlift.
They were. They explicitly defined their dream as American-style freedom and their nightmare as Stalin's future.
For Halvorsen, that must have made the transactional risk of flying these missions feel suddenly deeply personal.
It instantly transformed his perception. The stakes just shifted from moving tonnage to defending an ideal. And struck by their commitment and their refusal to beg, he felt he had to give them something.
So he searches his pockets.
And all he finds are those 2 sticks of Wrigley's Double Mint gum.
A ridiculously small offering for 30 starving children.
He hesitated. He genuinely feared that a riot might break out over something so scarce. It was a rational fear.
But he did it anyway.
He did. He broke the 2 sticks in half, and he passed the 4 small pieces through the barbed wire.
And what happened next is the detail that really highlights the deep psychological need these children were suffering from.
The result, he said, was unbelievable. There was no fighting, no shoving. The kids who got a piece tore off tiny slivers to share with their friends.
But it was the kids who got nothing that were the extraordinary part.
They were. They didn't complain. They asked for the foil wrappers and the paper lining.
They didn't even want the gum. They just wanted the remnants of it.
They brought the wrappers up to their noses and just inhaled the scent of peppermint and sugar. A sensory memory of sweetness, of normalcy, of a world that wasn't defined by war and starvation.
It was the symbol that mattered more than the substance.
The symbol was everything. Halvorsen was so moved he made a promise right then and there. He told them he would come back the next day with enough candy for everyone.
Which created a logistical challenge. How would they know which plane was his? There's a C-54 landing every 30 seconds.
So Halvorsen improvised his unique signal. He told them, "I will wiggle my wings." And that simple action earned him his famous German nickname.
Onkel Wackelflügel.
Uncle Wiggly Wings, the spontaneous psychological operation, was officially born.
Okay, so he makes the promise, but now he has to deliver. And that required immediate and covert logistics back at Rhine-Main Air Base.
This was a genuine rogue military act. He knew he couldn't wait for official approval. The kids were going to be at that fence the next day.
So what did he do?
He recruited his co-pilot and his flight engineer. The 3 of them pooled all their personal rations, chocolate bars, gum, lifesavers, but they immediately hit a critical engineering problem.
You can't just throw candy out of a moving airplane.
Exactly. A chocolate bar, even a small one, dropped from a plane could seriously injure a child.
So they needed a delivery system.
They did. And it required some immediate field-level improvisation. Halvorsen used his own handkerchiefs. He tore them into squares and made these little miniature parachutes.
Tying the corners with string.
Tying the corners with string, attaching the candy as the small, carefully weighted payload. The handkerchiefs would provide just enough drag to slow the candy down, let it drift gently to the ground.
So July 18th, 1948, the first drop.
That's the day. Halvorsen makes his approach to Tempelhof. He rocks the wings of his C-54, the Signal, and his engineer shoves 3 of these little bundles out of the aircraft's flare chute.
A flare chute, a tiny opening used for emergency signal.
Exactly. And the kids on the ground, they saw it, they cheered, they waved.
And this covert action continued for weeks.
It did. Other pilots in his squadron started to notice the growing crowds at the fence. They started donating their personal rations to Halvorsen's little stash. It was becoming this grassroots, internal military movement of kindness.
But you can't really run a highly visible air mission covertly for very long. The secrecy started to unravel.
It was inevitable. 2 things happened. First, the administrative staff at Tempelhof Base Operations started getting a massive amount of fan mail.
Addressed to
Onkel Wackelflügel, or Uncle Wiggly Wings. The sheer volume of letters was impossible to ignore. There was clearly something going on.
And then came the moment that forced the official confrontation. A candy bar nearly hit a German journalist.
It did. And that journalist not only avoided getting hurt, but he managed to snap a defining photograph of the little parachutes descending.
And that picture ended up in a Berlin newspaper.
And the cat was out of the bag. The story was now out of the military sphere and in the global public eye.
So Halvorsen gets summoned immediately. His squadron commander, Colonel James Hahn, calls him in. And Hahn had just gotten a furious phone call from General Tunner himself.
And Halvorsen was absolutely expecting a court-martial. He knew he'd violated several strict flight regulations, unauthorized modification of the aircraft, unauthorized jettisoning of objects.
Severe offenses under Tunner's hyper-efficient regime.
Very severe. But the conversation that followed really shows the political shrewdness of these commanders. Colonel Hahn wasn't just mad about the rules, he was mad about the surprise. He told Halvorsen, "You got me in a little trouble there." He was put out because he was sandbagged.
Sandbagged, which in military terms means you've blindsided your superior officer with unexpected news that puts them on the spot.
Right. Tunner was furious that he didn't know about this first, not necessarily that it was happening at all.
That General Tunner's final decision is, I think, a defining strategic moment of the Cold War. This is the stern disciplinarian, the architect of cold, hard efficiency. Why didn't he court-martial Halvorsen?
Because Tunner, for all his focus on logistics, had a keen sense for morale and, crucially, for public relations.
He saw the propaganda value.
Immediately, when Halvorsen explained the whole story, the children valuing freedom over food, Tunner recognized this was an unparalleled propaganda gift. The Soviets were painting the Allies as imperialist occupiers. Halvorsen's gesture was proof of the opposite. It was a weapon against their narrative.
A gift that military hardware couldn't deliver.
Precisely. So Tunner sanctioned it. He told Halvorsen, "Keep it up." But he ordered him to keep him informed to avoid any more sandbagging.
And with that, Operation Little Vittles was officially born. It was recognized as a highly potent, authorized symbol, a rare, intentional injection of humanity into Tunner's otherwise purely technical logistical machine.
With that official military sanction, Operation Little Vittles just scaled up exponentially.
But now the demand for candy and parachutes was way beyond what the pilots could supply from the personal rations.
Oh, yeah. The solution to this new, massive logistical problem, it didn't come from the military supply chain. It came directly from the generosity of the American public, from the home front.
This is the industrialization of sweetness. Yeah. It goes from a rogue military act to a national volunteer effort.
It does. And the main hub for this grassroots mobilization was a surprising place, Chicopee, Massachusetts.
Why Chicopee?
Westover Air Force Base, which is in Chicopee, was the primary training and transport hub for the entire airlift mission back in the States. So when the news of the candy bomber hit the American press, the city of Chicopee basically adopted the mission as its own.
It became the logistical heart of Operation Little Vittles.
It did. The whole thing was organized by a man named Wilfred B. Thiverge. He was the secretary to the city's mayor. He coordinated a volunteer effort that just took over community life.
What was the scope of it?
I mean, think about this. 22 local schools set aside dedicated time every single week for students to sit there and sew thousands of these little handkerchief-sized parachutes.
Incredible. Students sewing parachutes instead of doing their normal schoolwork.
And the local fire station on Grape Street became the official assembly and shipping headquarters for the whole operation.
But the demand for material, for cloth, must have created shortages really fast.
It did, which led to some truly creative material innovation. This is a fantastic little twist in the archives. They ran out of normal muslin and silk almost immediately. The breakthrough came when the Bud Manufacturing Company of Philadelphia donated 11,000 yards of high-grade Irish linen.
That sounds expensive. Why would a company just donate 11,000 yards of Irish linen?
Because it wasn't pristine cloth. This material was obsolete engineering tracings.
What are those?
Imagine huge sheets of starched linen covered in black, waterproof ink drawings of complicated industrial blueprints and designs that were just no longer needed.
So they were literally repurposing industrial waste into symbols of hope. But starched, ink-covered linen doesn't sound like it would make for very good parachutes.
You're exactly right. It was stiff as a board, which required another incredible volunteer step. A local business, the Holgate Laundry, stepped in.
And what did they do?
They took on the huge task of laundering all 11,000 yards of this rigid, starched, ink-covered linen to soften the fibers enough so they could be used as parachutes. It just shows you the dedication at every single step of this grassroots chain.
And there's that great anecdote about the secrecy of the tracings.
Thiviers, the organizer, he joked that if the Russians ever found any of this repurposed material, they'd think the U.S. wasn't dropping candy, but was deliberately scattering industrial secrets all over Berlin.
It's a nice moment of humor in the middle of all this.
It is. And once that public momentum built, the industrial support just flooded in.
Right.
The American Confectioners Association joined in, donating tons of candy. Major corporations like the Lifesaver Corporation sent 1,200 rolls of Lifesavers alone. Hershey and Wrigley, the company that made the gum that started it all, became major donors.
So let's put the final scale of this industrialization of sweetness into perspective. What were the final numbers?
The Chicopee headquarters, just on its own, shipped 18 tons of candy. And when you look at the final total for the entire operation, from July 48 until the airlift wound down in September 49, it's approximately 23 tons.
46,000 pounds of candy.
And every single ounce of that had to be handled, sewn into a parachute, bundled, and deployed.
An incredible effort.
It required over 250,000 of these improvised parachutes, deployed by more than 25 different aircraft crews who voluntarily carried that extra payload and did the wing-waggling maneuver. And it all started from one unauthorized gesture powered by 2 sticks of gum.
The statistics are amazing. They prove the scale. But the deep emotional and personal impact of Operation Little Vittles is really best illustrated through the story of one child, Mercedes Wild.
Yes. Mercedes was a 7-year-old girl living in West Berlin during the blockade. She was living that troglodytic existence we talked about, and her story gives us this critical lens on the recipient's side of this soft power equation.
And despite the operation's growing scale, despite the 250,000 parachutes, Mercedes, like a lot of the smaller kids, could never actually catch one.
It was a brutal competition. The parachutes would drift, and the older, stronger boys were always faster, more aggressive. They always got to the candy first. So Mercedes was just constantly left with this feeling of disappointment, watching hope drift just out of her reach.
So frustrated, she took her grandmother's advice. And her grandmother wisely told her, if you want something, you have to ask the person who gives it.
So Mercedes sits down and she writes a letter. And she addresses it simply and powerfully. My chocolate uncle, Tempelhof Airport.
Which shows this incredible faith that this symbolic figure, this Onkel Wackelflugel, was real and accessible and would actually read her letter.
It does, and her request was very specific. It was focused on her immediate survival concerns, not just a desire for candy. She mentioned her white chickens.
Right. What was the issue with the chickens?
She explained that the continuous noise of the airlift planes, the C-54s landing every 30 seconds, day and night, it was terrifying her little flock of white chickens. And it caused them to stop laying eggs.
And in a city where 900 calories a day was the norm, those eggs were a critical source of food for her family.
A vital source.
Yeah.
So she proposes a trade-off, a very sophisticated one for a 7-year-old. She said she was willing to endure the noise, the relentless sound of freedom, if he would drop candy specifically for her. And she gave him a landmark.
When you see the white chickens, drop it there.
Exactly.
Cool.
And Halvorsen got the letter. But he faced this genuine, practical problem, a logistical nightmare on the micro scale. How do you find a few white chickens in the ruins of Berlin from hundreds of feet in the air, moving at over 100 miles an hour?
You can't.
He couldn't. The drop was impossible. But instead of just ignoring the plea, he chose to maintain that personal connection. He wrote back to her. He sent his response through the regular Berlin mail system.
And he enclosed a small package.
He did. It had a lollipop and, ironically, the very thing that started the whole operation, peppermint gum.
And Mercedes' reaction to the contents of that package gives us this wonderful, nuanced insight into the real value of the gift.
It does. She actually disliked the peppermint gum. She said the smell was unfamiliar, like toothpaste, and she promptly traded the gum for a glass marble with a neighborhood boy.
So the candy itself was irrelevant.
Completely irrelevant. The material goods were quickly discarded, but the letter is sacred. She recalled years later, "The most important thing for me was this letter. The chocolate uncle became a symbol of my father, who she had lost in the war."
Wow.
The gesture of personal acknowledgement, the symbol of connection and care that was infinitely more valuable than the commodity. Halvorsen had replaced the fear of the conqueror with the face of a benevolent protector.
And this correspondence started a lifelong bond that really became a microcosm of German-American reconciliation.
It did. Decades later, in 1972, Halvorsen came back to Berlin, this time as the commander of Tempelhof Airfield. Mercedes, now an adult, invited him to dinner. And she produced the original letter he had written her back in 1948, perfectly preserved. This long relationship just demonstrates how the psychological investment of Little Vittles paid dividends in trust and alliance for the next 50 years.
Okay, so let's pull back and synthesize the enduring strategic legacy of this operation. We've established the material value was, basically insignificant, but the psychological value was immeasurable.
Operation Little Vittles was soft power, and it was being deliberately wielded as a weapon.
A weapon against what, specifically?
Against the relentless Soviet narrative. You have to remember, the Soviets were broadcasting nonstop propaganda that painted the Western Allies as temporary, cruel, imperialist occupiers who would ultimately abandon the German people to starvation. They were using psychological warfare to create panic and fear.
And the candy drops shattered that narrative in a way that tons of coal just couldn't.
They provided tangible, visible, irrefutable proof that individual Americans cared about individual Berliners. It showed a commitment that went beyond military necessity or geopolitical contracts. It showed human solidarity.
It goes back to that famous quote from a Berliner who told Halvorsen, "It wasn't chocolate, it was hope."
That's the core of it. And that hope was a strategic asset because it secured the loyalty of the civilian population.
Which was the key to the whole thing.
The success of the airlift ultimately rested on the resolve of the West Berliners to withstand the blockade. If their morale had collapsed, the entire operation would have failed. And by showing this genuine compassion for the children, the future generation, the Allies secured their most vital asset, the hearts and minds of the people.
It also helped shift the moral terrain back home in the United States, securing that vital domestic support for what was an incredibly expensive operation.
Think about that short historical window. It's only 3 years after the end of World War II, and you have American school children in Massachusetts voluntarily sewing parachutes to drop candy to German children.
It humanized the former enemy.
Completely, and that was essential for getting long-term American public support for the mission in Europe. It gave a compelling, non-controversial human face to a very expensive risk.
The blockade ended in May of 1949, though the airlift continued for a few more months to build up stocks. Halvorsen rotated back to the U.S., but that defining moment, it stayed with him. It became a template for his life's work.
He saw the Berlin airlift not as a one-off event, but as a blueprint for future humanitarian interventions. He replicated the candy bomber model again and again, even well into his retirement decades later.
For example, during Operation Provide Promise in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1994, Halvorsen, long retired from the Air Force, got on a C-130 to drop candy to children suffering through the Balkan conflict.
He did it again for 𝐏𝐂𝐂𝐓 refugees fleeing the war in Albania in 1999. He institutionalized the concept. He actively supported a U.S. serviceman in Iraq who is known as Chief Wiggles.
Chief Wiggles.
Who explicitly modeled his distribution of school supplies and candy to Iraqi children on the original Operation Little Vittles model. He understood that small personal acts build massive bridges of trust.
And his legacy also continues through his participation in the Department of Defense's longest-running humanitarian airlift, the annual Christmas Drop.
Delivering essential supplies to remote islands across Micronesia, yeah. His story has been cemented in our cultural history. Through books, major recognition from institutions like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, and his foundation, the Gail S. Halvorsen Aviation Education Foundation, continues to promote his core principle.
Service before self.
A principle born right there at that barbed wire fence.
And that brings us to our final synthesis. Gail Halvorsen passed away in 2022. He was 101 years old. He lived a life that spanned from the golden age of flight to the modern aerospace era. But its defining moment was always that simple, unauthorized act of breaking a stick of gum in half at a fence in a ruined city.
Our deep dive confirms it. Operation Little Vittles was anything but a charming sidebar. It was a central, critical, and intentional component of the Berlin airlift's overall psychological success.
The most effective weapon against the Soviet strategy wasn't just the coal to heat the homes.
It was the delivery of personal, tangible hope to warm the hearts of the next generation.
And if you look at the ultimate impact on that specific demographic, the children at the fence, the generation that was supposed to become the next iteration of the Hitler Youth.
They were instead transformed by this unexpected demonstration of compassion.
They grew up not in hatred, but in gratitude.
They became the staunchest defenders of democracy and the transatlantic alliance in Europe. That micro-level act of compassion secured a moral and diplomatic victory that military hardware and logistical efficiency alone could never have achieved.
It's like Halvorsen famously said, giving credit to that one chance encounter, 2 sticks of gum changed my life forever. And the evidence we've explored today confirms that they also helped change the course of global history by defining the moral high ground in the early Cold War.
So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over. Strategic geopolitical goals are often secured not by macro-level military strength or massive economic aid, but by these micro-level acts of empathy. Acts that demonstrate a genuine, sustained commitment to the individual on the receiving end.
So if we look at today's global conflicts and crises, what seemingly small gesture, what modern-day equivalent of 2 sticks of gum, holds the potential for the greatest long-term diplomatic and moral impact?